I've always been passionate about hunting. From a young age, my grandfather would tell me stories of his adventures in the forest, and I grew up eager to experience my own expeditions. That week, I decided it was time to explore new territory. I invited my two best friends, Oliver and Jackson, to join me on a hunt in a forest none of us knew well. It was a remote location, seldom spoken of among hunters, but known for its wild and unexplored beauty. On Friday night, we gathered at my house to plan the trip. Old maps were spread out on the wooden table, flashlights and machetes within reach. The excitement was palpable. Oliver, always the most cautious, brought a stack of guides and compendiums on wilderness survival. Jackson, on the other hand, was more focused on local stories and legends, something we had, until then, not paid much attention to. "Have you ever heard of the Caboclinhas?" Jackson asked, his voice low and serious. Oliver and I exchanged confused glances. They are female spirits that, they say, protect the forest. My grandmother always talked about them. They are said to be small, as quick as the blink of an eye, with long hair covering their faces. They defend the forest with their whistles. When they seem close, they are far, and when they seem far, they are close. Many believe it is because of them that this forest has never been fully explored. We laughed a bit at Jackson's seriousness, but a hint of unease settled in me. Something about the way he told the story, the conviction in his eyes, made it hard for me to completely dismiss the legend. However, our excitement for the adventure quickly smothered any initial fear. It was just a story, after all. Or so we thought. We spent the night reviewing our plan, checking our equipment, and reinforcing our backpacks with supplies. We would hit the road at dawn, ready to face the unknown. Our destination was a dense and remote forest, several hours' drive from any civilization. The dirt road leading there was winding and full of potholes, testing the endurance of our old Jeep. However, the initial excitement overpowered any discomfort. Oliver was at the wheel, Jackson by my side, and I, in the back seat, watched as the landscape gradually changed from open fields to a thick, impenetrable green curtain. We arrived at the entrance of the forest by late afternoon. The sun was slowly hiding behind the trees, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. We disembarked, stretching our legs after the long journey, and began organizing our equipment. In front of us, the forest rose majestically, but with an aura of mystery that made us hesitate for a moment. As we checked our backpacks and weapons, the silence of the forest enveloped us uncomfortably. There were no birds singing, nor the sound of leaves stirred by the wind, just a profound and oppressive silence. This auditory void was disturbing, as if the forest itself were watching us. "Strange, isn't it?" Oliver said, breaking the silence. Jackson nodded but said nothing, his eyes sweeping the dense vegetation as if searching for something hidden. I felt a chill down my spine but tried to ignore it, attributing it to the anxiety and excitement of the adventure. After a quick meal, we prepared to enter the forest. We had only taken a few steps inside when a sharp whistle cut through the air. It seemed to come from afar, but it sounded clear as if it were right beside us. We stopped, exchanging confused and apprehensive glances. "It was just a bird, right?" I asked, trying to sound confident. Oliver and Jackson agreed, although their expression suggested otherwise. We continued walking, but each step seemed to take us deeper into a place where time and space did not follow the usual rules. As darkness deepened, the forest became increasingly oppressive. The branches of the trees closed over us like skeletal claws, and the path ahead seemed less clear. The feeling of being watched did not lessen. On the contrary, it grew with every moment. Then we saw it for the first time. Among the shadows of the trees, something small and agile moved swiftly, almost imperceptibly, like a flicker. We stopped, trying to focus our vision, but the darkness and constant movement made it impossible to discern any clear shape. "Did you see that?" Jackson whispered, his voice barely disguising the fear. Oliver and I nodded affirmatively, feeling the same rising terror. The forest, once an invitation to adventure, now seemed like a labyrinth filled with traps and secrets. The legend of the Caboclinhas, previously just a story, was beginning to become a frightening reality that slowly enveloped us. We advanced through the forest, the darkness surrounding us like an oppressive cloak. Our steps seemed to echo in the silent vastness, and the sensation of being watched did not diminish. The first whistle had been just the beginning. Suddenly, a new whistle cut through the air, sharper and longer than the previous one. Oliver stopped abruptly, raising his hand to signal us. Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice trembling. Jackson and I nodded affirmatively, our senses on high alert. The whistle seemed to come from all directions, disorienting us. "It's closer this time," Jackson said, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. But it was impossible. The whistle seemed to play with us, echoing among the trees in a way that confused us. And then, out of nowhere, it stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. We continued to move forward, the tension evident in every movement. Our eyes tried to penetrate the darkness, searching for any sign of movement. That's when we saw a small, feminine figure with long hair covering her face, gliding between the trees. She disappeared as quickly as she had appeared, leaving us dumbfounded. Before we could react, another whistle echoed, this time sounding distant. If they are far, they are close," I whispered, recalling the legend Jackson had told. The realization of this truth made my heart race. We were surrounded. The whistles continued, sometimes near, sometimes far, becoming increasingly disorienting. It was as if the Caboclinhas were encircling us, playing with us, pushing us deeper into their territory. The feeling of helplessness grew, along with the fear. We tried to stay together, but the forest seemed to conspire against us. Branches tangled in our clothes as if they had a life of their own. The path in front of us disappeared and reappeared, guided by the treacherous whistles. Each step was taken with increasing hesitation. Then, in a moment of absolute silence, we heard light, quick footsteps around us. The Caboclinhas were getting closer, even though we couldn't see them clearly. A cold breeze blew, and with it came an indistinct whisper, as if the forest itself was speaking to us. "We need to get out of here," Oliver said, his voice laden with panic. I agreed, but the question was how. The forest, with its shadows and deceptive sounds, held us prisoners. And with each new whistle, we knew the Caboclinhas were getting closer. Then, in a fleeting moment, we saw one of them up close. Small, agile, and ghostly, with her long black hair dancing in the wind. She looked directly at us, although her face was hidden. And then, with one final whistle, she disappeared into the darkness, leaving us paralyzed with fear. The darkness seemed to close in on us even more, making each step heavier and every shadow more threatening. The whistles had ceased, but the silence that followed was even more oppressive. Each of us was lost in our own thoughts, trying to understand what was happening and how to get out of there. Then we saw them. Emerging from the shadows, the Caboclinhas materialized around us. Small female figures, their ethereal forms seemed to float above the leaf-covered ground. Their long black hair, like veils of shadows, completely covered their faces, leaving only the mystery of who or what was behind that curtain of strands. They moved with a sinister grace, almost as if they were dancing to a tune only they could hear. Oliver, Jackson, and I were frozen, unable to look away. It was as if we were hypnotized by their presence, a mix of terror and fascination holding us in place. One of the Caboclinhas approached me, her bare feet making no sound as they touched the ground. Her presence was palpable, a mix of cold and electricity that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I tried to back away, but my body wouldn't obey. She stopped just inches from me, and I could feel her icy breath. Oliver tried to speak, but the words died in his throat. Jackson was pale, his eyes wide reflecting pure terror. The Caboclinhas continued to move around us, their figures intertwining in a ghostly ballet. Every time we tried to move, they seemed to come closer, like predators playing with their prey. Then, without warning, they began to whistle again. This time, the sounds were sharper, piercing, like invisible blades cutting through the air. What frightened us even more was the realization that the whistles didn't come from their mouths, but seemed to emanate from the entire forest, an ambient sound that reverberated in our bones. Jackson finally broke the silence. "And we need to get out of here, now." His voice trembled, but the panic was enough to break the trance. We started to move, but the Caboclinhas interposed themselves in our path, each movement of theirs blocking our attempt to escape. Their figures dematerialized and rematerialized, a play of shadows and light that defied logic. The terror I felt at that moment was indescribable. The stories Jackson had told us became reality before our eyes. The forest, once an invitation to adventure, was now a labyrinth of terror where we were the prey. The Caboclinhas, with their ghostly appearances, surrounded us, turning the night into a living nightmare. In the midst of that suffocating atmosphere, with the Caboclinhas encircling us, something awakened in our memories. The stories of the elders, told by the fireside on full moon nights, returned to mind with frightening clarity. I remembered Dona Marilda, the elderly woman who lived on the outskirts of the town. She always warned the youth about the unexplored forest. The forest has guardians, she would say, her eyes narrowing as if seeing beyond the present. They are the Caboclinhas, ancient spirits that protect the land from intruders. They whistle to deceive, playing with the fear of men. Jackson, still trembling, began to murmur the legend his grandmother used to tell him as a child. They say that, long ago, a group of explorers entered this forest, seeking riches and land. They were never seen again. Those who escaped told stories of small women, fast as the wind, with hair hiding their faces. They would appear and disappear, whistling to confuse and disorient. And all, without exception, were punished if they did not respect the traditions. Oliver, trying to stay calm, remembered another part of the story. My aunt talked about the rituals. They demand an offering of tobacco. Only then, she said, can one obtain safe passage. Those who disrespect the forest or fail to offer the tribute meet their end at the hands of these guardians. Many return, but never the same. They bear the marks of a beating so fierce it breaks the spirit before the body. Each word spoken by us seemed to take on a life of its own, echoing in the darkness around us. The Caboclinhas, as if recognizing the stories, stopped moving and positioned themselves in a circle, watching us. The silence was once again absolute, broken only by the muffled sound of our panting breaths. The memories of the elders' warnings, once seen as mere superstitions, now became our only hope for survival. Every detail, every piece of advice, seemed crucial. The Caboclinhas were not just vengeful ghosts, but guardians of a balance we did not fully understand. As we struggled to stay calm, a thought formed in our minds. We would need to respect the traditions of the forest, remember and honor the stories of the elders, if we wanted to get out alive. The Caboclinhas, with their invisible eyes and ethereal movements, were more than just legends. They were the embodiment of ancient secrets and fears, and we were at their mercy. The tension was unbearable. The silence of the Caboclinhas, after hearing our recollections of the stories, only heightened our desperation. We needed to get out, and fast. Not sure what else to do, we decided to attempt a desperate escape. Let's split up and run in different directions, Oliver suggested, desperation evident in his voice. Jackson and I agreed, even though we knew this could be a deadly trap. The forest was a labyrinth, and the Caboclinhas knew every inch of it. But we had no choice. Our plan was simple. Each of us would run as fast as possible, trying to find an exit or at least a safe area where we could regroup. We took a deep breath, counted to 3, and launched ourselves into the darkness. We had barely started running when the whistles began again. This time, they were even more disturbing. A sharp whistle sounded far away, but as I ran towards it, it immediately moved behind me, as if playing with my perception. It seemed like the entire forest was alive with these treacherous sounds. I ran as fast as I could, branches and thorns tearing at my clothes and skin. With each step, the whistle shifted location, making me question every direction I took. My breathing was labored, my heart pounding in my chest, but the sensation of being followed did not lessen. Suddenly, a whistle sounded so close to my ear that I stopped abruptly, losing my balance and falling. I looked around, but there was nothing but the shadows of the trees and the impenetrable darkness. Silence returned for a moment, but it was soon broken by a distant whistle, echoing like a sinister invitation to keep running. As I tried to orient myself, I saw a shadow move swiftly out of the corner of my eye. It was one of the Caboclinhas, gliding between the trees with supernatural speed. Panic took over me again, and I resumed running, trying to ignore the whistles that now seemed to come from all directions at once. The terrain became increasingly difficult to navigate. Tree roots entwined like serpents across the ground, and with each step, the fear of tripping and being caught grew. The whistles continued to torment me, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape them. Each time I thought I was moving away, the sound surrounded me again, like an invisible predator. After what felt like hours, I found a small clearing in the forest, lit only by the pale light of the moon that managed to pierce through the tree canopies. I stopped, trying to catch my breath and think about the next step. But before I could do anything, the whistles intensified, creating a terrifying crescendo that made my ears hurt. It was then I realized the truth. The whistles were not just sounds. They were a trap, a cruel game by the Caboclinhas to keep us disoriented and lost. The deceptive nature of these sounds was proof that we were dealing with something far beyond our understanding. And, as I came to this realization, I knew our attempt to escape had failed. We were at the mercy of the forest's guardians, and there was nowhere to run. Exhausted and hopeless, I leaned against a tree, my body trembling with fear and fatigue. The whistles finally ceased, but the silence that replaced them was even more terrifying. I knew the Caboclinhas were close, invisible in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to act. The forest seemed to breathe around me, each leaf whispering ancient and threatening secrets. Without warning, I felt a strong tug at my legs. I fell to the ground, the impact knocking the breath from my lungs. Before I could get up, I was dragged by invisible hands through the dense vegetation. I tried to scream, but my voice seemed to be swallowed by the forest. In panic, I realized I had been captured. When they finally stopped, I found myself in a small clearing, where Oliver and Jackson were already captive. They were tied up with thick vines, their faces pale and dirty. The Caboclinhas began to materialize around us, their ethereal forms and invisible eyes fixed on us. Their movements were quick and graceful, like a macabre dance of ghosts. One of them approached me, her black hair falling like an impenetrable veil. She lifted one pale hand and murmured something in a language I didn't understand. Immediately, I felt the vines tighten around my wrists and ankles, binding me with inescapable strength. Each attempt to move only seemed to tighten the knots further. The other Caboclinhas began to whistle again, but this time, the sounds formed a kind of sinister melody, a distorted lullaby that made my blood run cold. I understood that I was about to witness the punishment ritual Jackson had mentioned. With precise and synchronized movements, the Caboclinhas began to circle us, their forms dematerializing and rematerializing like living shadows. Fear immobilized us, and the sense of powerlessness was overwhelming. They approached one by one, their icy fingers touching our skin. Each touch was like an electric shock, spreading pain and terror through our bodies. Then the beating began. It wasn't ordinary physical violence. It was a sensation of being torn from inside out, a pain that transcended the body and reached the soul. Each invisible blow carried away a fragment of our life force, leaving us weaker and more helpless. The Caboclinhas moved with supernatural speed, their long hair swirling around their hidden faces like a whirlwind of darkness. Oliver screamed first, a sound of despair that echoed in the clearing, and was then muffled by the whistles and murmurs of the Caboclinhas. Jackson and I tried to resist, but soon succumbed to the unbearable pain. It was as if every fiber of our being was being punished for our audacity to invade that sacred territory. Time lost all meaning. I couldn't tell if the ritual lasted minutes or hours. When it finally stopped, we were exhausted, the pain turning into a numbing numbness. The Caboclinhas slowly withdrew, the whistles decreasing until they completely disappeared. Silence returned, but this time, it was laden with a somber promise. They left us there, tied up and broken, the clearing illuminated only by the pale light of the moon. The punishment had been delivered, and we now knew that those ancient stories were more than just legends. They were warnings of a power that still inhabited those lands, a power that did not forgive intruders. The night seemed endless. Tied up and injured, each of us struggled against exhaustion and fear. The shadows danced around, but the Caboclinhas had disappeared, leaving only the memory of the pain and terror they had inflicted. Finally, when the first light of morning began to filter through the tree canopy, the vines that bound us loosened and fell. Slowly, we stood up, our bodies sore and our minds numb. We looked around, fearing that the Caboclinhas could return at any moment. Oliver was the first to speak, his voice hoarse and broken. "We need to get out of here. Now." We agreed without hesitation, the urgency in his words mirroring our own desperation. With faltering steps, we began to make our way back. The forest, which had once seemed an invitation to adventure, was now a labyrinth of threats and painful memories. Every bird whistle, every rustling of leaves made us shudder, fearing a new attack. The sunlight filtering through the trees brought a slight comfort, but it could not completely dispel the darkness we felt inside. As we walked, Jackson began to speak, his voice low and laden with reflection. My grandmother always said that the forest does not forgive those who do not respect it. We thought they were just stories to scare children, but she knew. They all knew. Oliver nodded, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. And we were arrogant, thinking we could explore this place without understanding its rules. The Caboclinhas, they weren't just punishing us. They were teaching us. Each word resonated with a bitter truth. We had disrespected the forest, ignored the warnings of the elders, and paid a high price for it. But at the same time, we survived. We had been released, not out of mercy, but perhaps as a warning to others. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, we found the way back out of the forest. The relief of seeing the dirt road was almost overwhelming. We stepped out from the shadow of the trees, feeling the warmth of the sun on our faces, and silently promised never to return. As we climbed into the jeep, the forest seemed to watch us, silent and vigilant. We knew now that the story of the Caboclinhas was not just a legend, but a living, terrifying reality. And with this certainty, we left, each of us carrying the visible and invisible scars of that fateful night. We would never return. The forest had taught us a lesson we would never forget. And even from a distance, the sound of the whistle still echoed in our minds, a constant reminder of the power and mystery of the Caboclinhas.